Welcome to the recording for Politics and the World, Section D. And you'll see that Section D is the governments of Africa and the Middle East. So as I slide down here a little bit, you'll see there's the Section B recordings and the write-up. There's a Section D recording in the write-up, or Section C. And here's the Section D write-up. And then, of course, this is the recording that'll get posted there. And when we finish up Section D, then this actually wraps up this unit. The Politics and the World unit. And you can see that there are some other assignments to go along with this. So there's a project, A Culture of Iran, and then a couple of a quiz and a unit exam. So let's just jump right into this, and you'll see that this unit is going to cover Africa and the Middle East. And of course the Middle East, part of the Middle East is in Africa. So all right there together, there's civilizations developed at the same time. A lot of Africa did, and Africa and the Middle East, they trace back the development of mankind to that area of the world. So it's really important that we think about how that area of the world has developed and where it is today. So we're going to look at the different cultures and the religious and political structures in those regions, because that's really important, because their culture is such a strong influence on their daily lives. We'll look at how they developed after the end of World War II, and currently how human rights and civil conflicts plague the region still. This region, Africa, is really poor. The Middle East, of course, seems to have wars all the time. So lots of major issues in that region of the world. So after we finish Section D, be able to identify some of the political structures of the region, examine the cooperative nature between the nations in that region, look at civil and human rights concerns in the region, identify conflicts of different governments in the region, and finally look at the impact of culture and religious beliefs on the politics in the area. Here's a warm-up. Look at this. There would be 30 known conflicts on the African continent in 2009. So you can go to this website to take a look at that. And this talks about the conflicts. What it talks about are civil wars within countries, battles and wars between countries. So look at all these conflict zones, all the ones with the stars, and different things that are happening on the continent of Africa. It's amazing, isn't it? So let's just go right here to Nigeria. And you see right over here, Nigeria. You can read about it. So, they declared their independence in 1960, but they've had military coups, which means the military takes over the government. All kinds of things happening in Nigeria over the years. So you can read about all of these different conflicts that are happening. Angola is really one of the poorest countries in the world. Got independence in 1974, but then there are different rebel movements, meaning civil wars. And the civil war raged until the left-wing government won the military victory in 2002. And the United States was even involved in the war in Angola, the civil war in Angola a little bit. Somalia is a really a bad place. So they had a dictator until 1986, so then they collapsed into anarchy, and we learned what anarchy was in Section C, I think. We're talking about the absence of a government. And you can see there's Islamic militias. They fought with Ethiopia in 2006, so really bad things in Somalia. And in Somalia, this right here, this is the Suez region, and a lot of shipping goes from the Mediterranean Sea up here down into the Indian Ocean, and then into other parts of Asia and things like that. Somalia, this is all of Somalia here. They have pirates, and pirates often take over some of these shipping lanes. And you've probably heard about the pirates, the Somalian pirates that hold these ships for ransom and things like that. So it's amazing all the bad things that are going on in Africa. So explore some of those, learn a little bit more about some of them. I'm going to go ahead and close this out. Actually, the last thing I want to show you, down here is a country called South Africa. That's a country by itself down here. South Africa is unusual because it is a white-dominated country. It was settled by the Dutch, and the Dutch ruled it for decades. And so it's a white country, and then of course everything else in Africa is mostly African or black-skinned people. And of course the northern part of Africa around here are Mediterranean type of people. Different skin color, different customs. So Africa is really divided into three different things. The top part up here is more aligned with the Mediterranean region, like the Middle East. The central part of Africa is what we would call, what we think about, where the African American slaves, where they came from. And then the southern part of the African continent, the country of South Africa, has been white ruled. Okay, so go on to page 4, and we're going to go look at the Class Connect write-up like we always do. So on page 4, what was the result of European imperialism on Africa in the 19th century, so in the 1800s? The result of European imperialism. And what that means is that European countries like England, France, Great Britain, Belgium, other countries, they controlled many of the regions, many of the countries in Africa, many of the territories. So European nations, they economically were involved, so they would go down there and they would get lots of the resources from the area. So the 19th century marked intense European imperialism, and the result of that is that Europeans had conquered nearly the entire continent, leaving only 2 independent nations. And the Europeans took the natural resources that they could find. So this right here, all of this is the result of the European imperialism in the 1800s. Okay, back to the write-up. And also on page 4, why did African countries start to gain independence in the late 1940s and 50s? What you need to do is to think back, what happened in the 1940s? Well, in the 1940s, World War II happened. From 1939 through 1944, World War II happened. So in World War II, of course, it decimated Europe, because Europe was the center of World War II. So World War II left the European powers weakened. So because they are weak, then all these countries could fight for independence. So from the 1950s through the 60s, the 40s, 50s, 60s, the countries gained independence because the European powers that governed those countries, they were weakened by World War II. So that's the answer to that. What is the general history of many of the independent movements? Well, generally, the history was that they just had terrible instability, corruption, and things like that. I'm trying to find that specific answer on here. So really what you could do, all of these things, all of this stuff, and don't copy and paste this whole thing, but generally, the history of all these things is that the vast majority were run by, or actually it starts right here, their independence have been hampered by instability, corruption, violence, and authoritarianism, meaning one-person rule. Few of them have been able to sustain democratic governments, and many have cycled through revolutions and military dictatorships. So a lot of this paragraph right here, that's really the result of what happened. So that paragraph right here is really the answer to this question. Was the general history of many of those independent movements? Well, there's lots of corruption, civil war, human rights issues, things like that. But recently, the countries of Africa have started to get more unified. So they created what's called an African Union, similar to the European Union. So as we go take a look at a little bit about the African Union, that's the next question. In the African Union, what they wanted to do was to make it more stable. So despite the series of wars and things like that that brought military intervention and all that, they wanted to become more of a political organization, economic organization. If we go back to the Class Connect to see what that specific question is, it says, what are the main policies and initiatives of the African Union? The main policies right here, they set policies and initiatives to promote and defend African common positions on issues of interest to the continent and its people, to achieve peace and security, and to promote democratic institution, good governments, and human rights. So this is what the African Union wants to do. So this, you can see, is not as economic as the European Union, because the African countries are not economically powerful yet. They're not even close to being there. So what they need to do is they first want to get peace on the continent of Africa, then and solve lots of those problems related to peace and human indignity and things like that. Then they can move on to the economic part. So that's the answer to that question. But you can also see down here that they are trying to combat economy and really low standards of living. So the African Union, the 7th largest economy in the world, but they have very little international trade. But they do contain, look at this, 70% of the strategic minerals, gold, and aluminum in the world. So they're rich in natural resources, but they don't have enough money to take advantage of those natural resources. So they're really, really so poor. And that's really the biggest issue with the countries of Africa. Hey, listen and describe 3 of the main issues affecting many African nations. So move on to page 6. So page 6 starts talking about the World Cup, and of course the World Cup of soccer was held in 2010, and that was held in South Africa. South Africa, the country I talked about, that's the richest country in Africa. So they were able to hold it there. They built stadiums and did all kinds of things. Now the thing about that, even though the country of South Africa is rich, there are lots of poor people, mostly poor black Africans there. And when they built the stadiums for the World Cup, they displaced lots of those people. They tore down their villages and things like that so they could build stadiums for the World Cup, because the World Cup brought lots of money to the country of South Africa. So watch this video to learn a little bit more about how the World Cup affected South Africa. Some challenges in all of Africa. Look at this refugee camp. Lots of people live in refugee camps, and refugee camps happen because there might be like a civil war going on in the country. So the people flee the country into another country where they feel safer, but then they have no place to live, so they set up these tent cities. And you can see cardboard boxes, tents, different things like that is where these people live. And Darfur, this was terrible for the people of Darfur. Millions of people died because of the civil wars that happened. And it's just really, really a terrible thing. But you can see down here all the different problems that Africa has. Overpopulation. Now, one thing about population in Africa is that their standard of living is so low. In some countries in Africa, the average male might live to about 50 years old. The average female might live to 52. Here in the United States, the average person lives to 80. There's a couple countries in Africa, like Rwanda, where the average person might live to 43 or 44. So in that case, and their children don't live, their child death rate is really high. So often people need to have large families, like 10 or 12 children, because they're hoping that 7 or 8 of them might survive. because the children have to work to help support the family. AIDS is a huge epidemic in Africa. 64% of the world's cases are in Africa, in the southern part of Africa. Not the country of South Africa, but the southern part of it. Malaria, tuberculosis kill many people, kill many children. Genocide. Genocide is when people kill people for no reason. And in Rwanda, there was ethnic cleansing, meaning that the Tutsi tribe and the Hutu tribes were fighting one another. 45,000 people died from that. So here's what genocide is: planned extermination of a political, ethnic, or national group. So you have that going on in some of the places in Africa. And then finally, there are wars for many reasons. There are civil wars within a country. There are civil wars like right here, Sierra Leone. Millions of people have been displaced, murdered, or forced into slavery as military groups battle for the country's control. And you probably saw the movie Blood Diamond. Blood Diamond is about civil war in Africa because of the value of diamonds. Nigeria has problems because Nigeria is rich in oil. Well, there are battles over who controls the oil fields. Then finally, refugee camps. You saw the picture of refugee camps up above, but you can read about how many refugees are there. And then finally, the death toll. Look at this. In the Sudan, 500,000 people. Angola, because of civil wars, 500 million people dead. Rwanda, and actually I think this is incorrect. 500 million, that's 500 million. I think that is incorrect. This should probably be 500,000. No way 500 million people would die. They don't even have that many people in the country. Over 1 million dead in Rwanda. Over 1 million per year throughout Africa die of malaria. So you can see that it is incredible the lifestyle that these people unfortunately live. I lost something for a second there. Okay, so page 7, so we answered that one, 3 main issues. So you listen, describe. Page 10, 3 main religious cultures found in the Middle East. So now we're moving on to the Middle East. So we looked at Africa, and now we're moving on to the Middle East. Page 8 just talks about Darfur, and this you don't have to turn it in, but you can do a little bit of research and find out about the poor people of Darfur and what happened to them. Page 9, we're not doing discussions, but you can see the world's biggest secret that all these conflicts happening in Africa. So that's what this is about. And lots of people argue if this was happening in Europe or Asia, that everybody in the world would be outraged about it, but because it's down there and happening in Africa, not a lot of people are outraged about it. Okay, page 10. Now we're getting into the Middle East. So, of course, this is right here is the continent of Africa. And as I said before, many of these countries, the top part of Africa, are more aligned with the Middle East. Their religions, their culture, their politics are similar to the Middle East. And then, of course, we have all this part in Africa, this middle part of Africa, that is different from the northern part and different from the country of South Africa. But here you can see that traditionally the Middle East is all the dark green, but it also covers some of these other places because, again, their cultures are very similar. So really a lot of the turmoil, as this says, goes essentially unnoticed in the Western world, meaning Western world, that means the world of Europe and the United States. And if you look at this world map, the Western world is considered the United States and Europe. Eastern world is Asia. So Western world is probably considered the countries that are richer than most of the other countries, have a higher standard of living. But some of the issues in the Middle East carry over from Africa, but they've also happened in the Middle East for years. And there's just a huge, rich diversity of cultures, traditions, religions, and all that. And because of those different cultures and religions, the people don't get along very well. So Israel is right in the middle of it, of course. And some of the main religions. Let's go back to that, the write-up. I forgot what that question was. List and describe the three main issues. No, we did that. Three main religious cultures found in the Middle East. Okay. So the three main religious cultures, you have Christianity, Hinduism, and Islam are the three main religious cultures. Islam, Christianity, and Hinduism. And of course you also have the Jewish faith, but that is very small. It's just the country of Israel mostly, but it's very small compared to those other three. Those are the three main religions. Now, the history of the Middle East has been really violent over the last 100 years because the oil is really important, right? And you can see that Soviet Union, France, Italy, Great Britain, United States, we've all been involved in military issues in the Middle East to help control the region. A lot of people say because we need access to oil. But there have also been other conflicts, just political ones and religious ones, like the Arab-Israeli conflict. That's lasted since 1948. Because Israel is trying to, it was established as a country in 1948, but then the Arab countries in the Middle East do not want Israel to be its own country. And you can see the battles, the Iraq-Kuwait battles. Iraq invaded Kuwait for the oil, and the United States had to go in, and we were part of the Iraq War. Then there was a war between Iran and Iraq. So that was the first Persian Gulf War. So you can see how all of these wars took place. Then the Second Persian Gulf War. The U.S. invaded Kuwait because Iraq wanted to take over Kuwait. Then finally, the Iraq War that's going on now. So you can see all the different wars that are happening in the Middle East. And when we talk about Iran and Iraq, those are over here. Those are the bigger countries over here. At page 11, let's go back to the write-up. And the write-up says, so page 11, what is the name of the Union of Countries in the Middle East and what does it seek to do? So now we're looking at the government and religion in the Middle East. And the governments in the Middle East they're as diverse as the religions are, as the cultures are. Some governments have kingdoms because that was traditional in the Middle East. Hundreds and thousands of years ago, they had kingdoms. A lot of them still have kingdoms. You can see down here, everything that says monarch, that means it's run by a king. Now, Saudi Arabia, which is an ally or friend of the United States, authoritarian king, that means he has power. He runs almost everything. Constitutional monarchy. Now this is different, like this says, different from the European constitutional monarchies where the monarchs don't really have much power. Here, these constitutional monarchies, the monarchs do have power. They're the kings and queens. Then you have the typical constitutional democracy where there are free elections. However, in the case of Egypt, the people chose the president, and he was not a good president. So you have lots of these different things happen. Parliamentary theocracy, this means theocracy means it's run by religious people. So you can read right here that it's run by religious leaders. So obviously that country is very religious and sets standards by the religion that it follows. Then there's military dictatorships in Syria and Libya. We hear about this all the time. Right now, Syria, their government, their military dictatorship is killing hundreds of people a day because there's almost like having a civil war there. And finally, Iraq and Afghanistan, a constitutional parliamentary system where they have open and free elections, supposedly. But they still have autocrats and dictators that try to get power from time to time. So this area, this Middle East, they formed what's called the Arab League. The Arab League, you can see, was created to develop political, economic, cultural, scientific, and social programs to promote interests of the Arab world. So that's what the Middle East is also called sometimes. The area of the Middle East is called the Arab world. But of course, you have Israel there that is not an Arab country, and you have a few of the African countries that are not really Arab countries. But that region can sometimes be called the Arab region. So you can see that there are 22 countries that form the Arab League, and many that do not, obviously. Okay, page 12. Let's go back to the Class Connect write-up. So what three religions consider Jerusalem sacred, and what four sections is Jerusalem divided into? Well, Jerusalem, of course, is the most sacred city in the world, and historically, over thousands of years, many religions have controlled Jerusalem. But ultimately, Jerusalem is sacred to Christians, Jews, and Muslims. So historically, Christians, Jews, and Muslims have ruled Jerusalem at different times. Currently, Jerusalem is ruled by the Jews, the Israeli Jews. And you can see that it was a Hebrew word meaning city of peace. And of course, we all know, from the Bible that this was the center of where Jesus and where the Bible started. But these are the three countries, or the three religions, that consider Jerusalem sacred. And you can read all about how Jerusalem came to be. The Jewish people took control of it about 1,000 years before Christ, and it became the capital of the Jewish nation. And then Christians took over, and that's where they crucified Jesus, according to the New Testament, and also Muhammad from the Muslims was there. Then ultimately, lots of religions and things like that came to visit Jerusalem and considered it a part of their home. But finally, the city now is divided into four quarters, and you can see that these are the four quarters. There's a Christian area, a Muslim area, an Armenian area, and a Jewish area. So that's how Jerusalem is divided now. So it's divided on religion. Okay, page 13. Go back to the Class Connect write-up. So we did page 12, page 13. Why does there seem to be never-ending conflict in the Middle East? Well, page 13, this is going to explain it really well. So in the year 135, so this would be 135 years after Jesus was born, the Roman Empire spread to the Middle East, and it wanted to move the Jewish people out of the Holy Land. So this was considered the Holy Land, where Israel is right now. So they wanted to move them out. Then the beginning of the 20th century, which would be the 1900s, Great Britain was in charge of setting up a Holy Land for the Jews. You can see right here, established a safe place, a national homeland for the Jews, because their national homeland had been taken over. So the Great Britain, meaning England, was supposed to establish that. Well, they did establish that, and in 1947, the United Nations divided Israel up into a Palestinian part, which is Arab, and Jerusalem. So they divided it all up. So now you have a homeland that the Jews were promised that was then divided up, giving it to their enemies, the Palestinians, the Arabs. So now you have Israel, the Jews, fighting for their homeland. And you can see that what happened. Look at the map over here. Now there's a place called right here, the Gaza Strip, which is where Palestinians live inside Israel. There's what's called the West Bank right here, which is where Palestinians live inside the country of Israel. So can you imagine that? Having your worst enemies living within your country in their own section of your country. That's what happened. So you can read down through here, the Palestinians wanted control of many of the areas, so they control the Gaza Strip. And there are lots of Palestinians living there in the Gaza Strip, and then all the Jewish people living in the rest of Israel except the West Bank area. So you read down through this and see all the different issues that happen. In the There's even a huge wall and barriers all around the Gaza Strip. And you can see any day in the news, if you watch the news, you can hear about war and attacks that are happening in the Middle East. Right now, Israel is bombing Syria. And there have been wars between Israel and Egypt, Israel and Jordan. But here again, you have poor Israel here that is right in the middle of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, which are Arab countries, Muslim countries. And here the Jews in Israel are surrounded by all of them. So you can imagine why there are issues. So on that question, that was, why does there seem to be never-ending conflicts in the Middle East? Well, I just talked about, didn't I? Differences in religion, differences in the history of the region, historical conflicts, ranging back 2,000 years ago. And then, of course, we have now, if you go down below here, we have Hamas. Hamas is a military organization that's government, and Hamas, their goal is to get rid of the Jews. So now we have the battles we have now. We have in the Gaza Strip with Hamas. They bomb the Israelis, and the Israelis bomb Hamas in the Gaza Strip. You can see that on news every night. So you can see right down here, smuggling weapons in to attack Israel, airstrikes, missiles, and things like that. So the situation deteriorates because the goal of Hamas is to get rid of the Jews. Okay, go through that flashcard activity, see if you know anything. Now page 15, the war in Iraq. And let's go back to the write-up. Why did the U.S. get involved in the war with Iraq that became known as the Persian Gulf War? Well, this all started back in the 1980s and 70s when Saddam Hussein, he was the leader of Iraq. And Iraq, of course, has had lots of wars against Iran. They tried to take over Kuwait and the oil fields in Kuwait. So that happened in 1981. Iraq went into Kuwait to take over the oil fields, and actually wanted to burn the oil fields. So the United States, we wanted to protect Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Israel. So that's how we got involved in the Persian War. And the reason we got involved is we wanted to get rid of Saddam Hussein's armies from Kuwait. So we wanted to get the Iraqis and Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. So that's why we got involved in the Persian Gulf War in the early 1990s. Then, of course, in 2001, the September 11th attack, that was related. A lot of people think that Saddam Hussein, Osama bin Laden, and all of these were related. Many people think they weren't. But anyway, we wanted to get rid of Saddam Hussein. He was still in power at that time, and obviously wanted to go after Osama bin Laden. Ultimately, we ended up getting both of them. But Al-Qaeda, of course, is still really strong in the region. Here's a tutorial on stabilizing Iraq, so you can play that and learn a little bit about how we're trying to stabilize Iraq with our military presence there. Shock and awe, the war. So this was what President Bush called the war in Iraq, called shock and awe. So what you can do is you can go to this website and watch some of the videos about the war and what was happening at that time. Homework quiz. We don't do these, so don't worry about the homework quizzes. Page 19. You do have this activity to do. So in this activity, you're going to visit this website. You could create a portfolio of the nation of Iran. So you click on that link, and it takes you to the Eurasian Cultural Information Center. So you can see all the information over here. So you're going to do this report about Iran and create a portfolio report of the nation. from the videos or from what you see there. You can do a video, you can do a PowerPoint, or just a regular written report, and use different resources, the internet, magazines, newspapers, news shows if you can. And what you need to do, you need to discuss all 6 of these items. So if you're going to do a PowerPoint, each of these 6 items will be at least 1 slide. If you're going to do just a regular word processed report, then you need to have each of these 6 areas need to be side headings in your report, so I know what you're talking about. So there will be different sections in your report, not just a bunch of paragraphs thrown together. And you can click on the rubric and see how you're going to get graded on this. So this tells you a little bit more about it. So again, you're going to have 6 sections, clearly defined, so I know what you're talking about, and how you're going to get graded. So all 6 of those items are addressed. At least 4 sources are cited. Make sure, so at the end of your report you'll cite the 4 sources you used, whether they're websites or whatever they are. And make sure you use the proper website citations. Clear and focused to get the reader's attention. There's some good order to it and structure of your presentation, your report, whatever you happen to create. So this is what you're going to do. And of course, if you want to get a lower score, then don't do that stuff and just do this. But I hope you'll do it really well. Put some time and effort into it. So you can do it again as a video, as a multimedia presentation, or a written report in a word processor type program. Okay, the quiz. So obviously, I always have the quiz previews posted over on the left for you. And then finally, you have Politics of the World, the unit exam, and the unit exam previews over there for you. So here's everything we learned in this unit: forms of government in the region, the how governments formed across the world, and then of course we went to the Middle East and Africa and we learned about those countries. And early on in this unit we talked about Russia, North Korea, and China through communism and socialist governments and things like that. So that's all about Section D. So I look forward to your work coming in, look forward to you doing the Class Connect write-up and doing well in the quizzes, and of course you have the Culture of Iran project that you'll need to turn in. So that's all for you. I look forward to your work. Bye.